how humans survived in every time period. This is you, the average, everyday, modern human being. Historically speaking, you are soft, squishy, and weak. And although you may not look like it, you are an apex predator, residing at the very top of the global food chain. But this has not always been the case, and this evolution of human dominance has taken hundreds of thousands of years to manifest. And where it's gotten us is you laying on the couch ordering Uber Eats without a care in the world. But the struggles that humanity has faced to get us to this very position is anything but pretty. And it's for this very reason that we are going to be investigating exactly how humans endured and survived every era of history, as well as seeing what it would take for a modern human to survive in previous time periods. Let's begin. The Stone Age. The first thing you're going to notice after being dropped in the Stone Age is the sheer shock of how little you truly have. In the Stone Age, you have no phone, wallet, glasses, watch, clothes. You are truly left to your own devices, and it's up to you to figure out how to survive. Luckily, not too far in the distance, you notice a small tribe of humans, and you know better than to interact with them, so you start by observing them. One of the first things you notice is how little these people have. This small tribe of humans have animal pelts draped over their body, and beyond that, appear to only have a pile of rocks and sticks at their disposal. The settlement that they're in is rudimentary and looks almost temporary, and that's because humans at this point in the early Stone Age are still primarily nomadic, meaning that long-term settlements aren't established yet. And although these people are occupying this area now, they likely won't be there in a few months, as they will likely seasonally follow animals in different weather patterns. Taking a closer look at this pile of sticks, you notice that they're not just sticks, they're actually tools. And these rocks that they're carrying all serve a purpose. Some of these longer sticks have pointed, jagged rocks at the ends, while some of these shorter sticks have large black rocks attached to them. And you notice that these are spears and obsidian axes. You notice one of these people actually creating these tools. They are literally using stones to carve out other stones. At this point, you're already taking a mental note of how simple the Stone Age appears to be in comparison to the modern day. And while that is definitely true, it's important to also note that just because something is simple, it does not mean that it's easy. Besides just sitting around and crafting stone tools that literally define this entire time period, there are a lot of other skills required to survive. One of the more unlikely culprits is actually social skills, which may seem a bit random, but when you think about it, your tribe in the Stone Age is literally your lifeline. Every aspect of life is so time-consuming and takes so much effort. Collecting food, cooking food, fabricating tools, preparing pelts, migrating. Literally everything takes so long. And it truly does take a village in the Stone Age just to support each other, because everybody plays their role. We are talking about real hunter-gatherer times. And it's for this reason that you need to provide value to the group that you live in. Because if you are in a group and you are unable to perform in any aspect of your tribe, there's a very likely chance that you're going to be exiled. If your gathering sessions are consistently unfruitful, and if you are simply not pulling your weight in the group, then the entire group is going to have to make the decision between picking up your slack or cutting off the weakest link and exiling you from the tribe. And during a time where every day is a struggle to survive, you do not even have the luxury of picking up anybody else's slack. And for the edgy lone wolves watching this video, being alone in the Stone Age may not seem like such a bad thing, until you realize that not only does every aspect of life require a group to truly thrive, but in this time period, you're also susceptible not only to nature, but natural predators. Because that's right, in the Stone Age, humans definitely have natural predators. And if one of these predators see a lone human walking around, they're either going to assume you're old, sick, exiled, lost, and it doesn't really matter which one is the case, because in any of those instances, you are vulnerable, meaning that a predator can easily make you lunch. With this new realization, you decide to introduce yourself to this group and make yourself at home, because the only way you as a modern person has any chance is by making some good friends. Fortunately, this tribe takes you in, but you are tasked with your first job, making fire. Another essential skill of Stone Age survival. As you gather a few sticks, you realize that the entire tribe is looking at you. And they didn't give you this task as a job, they gave it to you as a test. Because if you can't start a fire, then there is absolutely no way you can pull any weight, and they're better off leaving you behind. Although fortunately for you, you watched Survivor Man a time or two and spun a stick on a log like your life depended on it, getting a kindling going, and then a small fire, proving your worth to the group and ensuring your survival, at least for that day. As the day goes on, you are informed that it's now time to hunt. The tribe has sharpened tools, a new fire, and it's time to eat. And you're being invited to hunt with the tribe. With no other option, you accept the offer and you begin on the journey. One of the first things you realize is that while these people may be human, they're definitely not the same as you, because their endurance is next level. These hunters that you are struggling to keep up with can seemingly run for days. And not only that, they know exactly where they're going and they can read the landscape like the back of their hands. This deep connection to the landscape you inhabit is crucial for long-lasting survival in the wild. And as a modern human, it's a skill set you're going to have to develop. But for a Stone Age human, this is the only life you know, because you are still deeply connected and ingrained in nature. After a successful hunt, you return back to the camp exhausted, while the others you went out with seem barely phased at all. And that's because for you, this was the workout of a lifetime. But for these prehistoric people, this was simply everyday life. And this experience gave you a lot of context into how humans survived in the Stone Age. Survival wasn't a hobby or a job or entertainment. Survival was a daily task, day in and day out. And there was no work-life balance, because your life was work. And anything you needed, you had to work for. The clothes on your back, the food in your stomach, the wood in the fire, the stone on your spear, the cave that you're sleeping in. Everything required effort. And with that, we understand that Stone Age humans survived because of their deep understanding of the landscape that they inhabited. And these skills allowed them to consistently find places to live temporarily or even long term. And on top of their geographical knowledge, their ability to fashion tools out of materials simply laying on the ground is extremely impressive, and allowed them to not only catch animals and protect themselves, but also to create clothing and process food and make other tools. And with that, if you could understand the landscape and develop your own tools, then the only other thing you really needed was the ability to create fire. And with that, you had every aspect of life essentially covered. Besides, obviously, shelter and water, but those are also part of understanding the landscape, because the water that you get comes from natural sources. And during the early Stone Age, most of the places you inhabit are also typically natural structures, or extremely simple structures made using natural materials. Because of this experience you've had with these Stone Age people, you've gained a newfound respect for prehistoric humans. And although you now have a better understanding of how cave people lived, you also are very certain that you want to spend no more time during the Stone Age, because you've been spoiled by the modern day, and the Stone Age is interesting, but it also makes camping look like a 5-star resort. And with that, we decide it's time to move on to the next time period. The Bronze Age. One of the first things you need to be aware of before we drop you into the Bronze Age is this. The Stone Age literally took place over the course of millions of years. But the Bronze Age is where we truly see the beginning of human technological development hit an exponential point. Because what humans are about to develop over the next couple thousand years is going to make the development over the millions of years in the Stone Age seem like child's play. Although it was obviously a necessary part of our human development. After being dropped in the Bronze Age, you almost don't recognize the world that you were looking at. Obviously, there are some glaring similarities between the Stone Age and the Bronze Age, but the differences are stark. One of the first things you notice is that the people aren't wearing pelts anymore. They're wearing clothes. And now you feel underdressed because you're the only one wearing a loincloth. But beyond just the clothing that people are wearing, society looks completely different than it did in the Stone Age. In the Bronze Age, we see people begin to create settlements, and with that, we see agriculture, we see animal farming, we see settlements, and for the first time, we see two very important innovations. We see metal forging, and we see the wheel. The collection and forging of metals is what obviously separates the Stone Age and the Bronze Age. And while upgrading from obsidian tools to copper swords is definitely an improvement and ensures that tools are able to last a lot longer, it isn't the only notable change by far. Having tools made in a new material is cool, but having a new material that allows the door to open for expertise to flourish and for unique tools to exist definitely opened up the floodgates for more innovation. With metal forging existing, we now have a method for creative people to develop and hone in their skills. And instead of relying on using a dull rock to sharpen a sharp rock, we now have the opportunity to create nearly anything we can imagine, at least for the time. And with that, the simple introduction of this new metal alone, society begins to evolve, because now we have artisans and experts, and then we have early jobs and an early economy based off of these new items and metals. And things are already developing at a pace quicker than I can describe. But besides just having new metals and new jobs because of it, we also have the wheel. And the wheel was crucial for literally mobilizing society. Not only did we see civilization establish settlements in the Bronze Age, but we also saw settlements become connected because of the wheel. And these settlements became connected through trade routes and war. Two things that also went on to further evolve society. However, even with all of these revolutionary technological developments, the Bronze Age to a modern human still seems like an extremely slow and barbaric way of life. And for that reason, you need to learn exactly how to acclimate to this time period. Fortunately, the development you found yourself near has almost everything a human could need. And one of the first things you do is get yourself some new drip, because that loincloth had the ladies and the men looking at you the wrong way. Walking through this village, you understand that community is still extremely important. However, this stage of the game, by game I mean history, is a lot less grindy. Instead of spending all day looking for berries, you're simply picking the berries in the garden. Instead of spending the entire day looking for a goat, you are simply taking one from the farm. And instead of feeling like you have to do everything all the time, for the first time you feel like you actually have the opportunity to specialize and focus on something. And although things are definitely looking a lot better than they did in the Stone Age, in the Bronze Age, you still need to make sure that you're carrying your own weight. Because at the end of the day, you need to put a roof over your head and food in your stomach today. And what that means is you once again need to provide value. And while the value you provide in the Bronze Age looks different than the Stone Age, the general concept still applies. There are no free lunches, and if you want to survive, you need to do something. Although in the Bronze Age, there are more opportunities. Since your goal is survival, you decide that joining any sort of army is not for you, and you're also not interested in any form of combat sport involving a copper sword. You briefly ponder potentially becoming a criminal, because then anything you want is free. Although, after seeing how basically every crime can be punishable by death during this period of time, you realize that a modest job may be your best way of surviving. Even though there's a lot more technology in the Bronze Age, the components required for life are still the same. You need food, water, and shelter. And the one job that you identify that can provide you all of this is farming. Because of the new tools and methods introduced in the Bronze Age, mass farming is at an all-time high, at least relatively. And for that reason, there's a lot of opportunity to work within farming. And a lot of these jobs provide food, shelter, and water in return for your all-day, indefinite, back-breaking labor. It's not glamorous, but your goal here is survival. You're not trying to be rich or famous, you simply just want to live a long, safe life. But after making yourself useful on the farm and breaking your back, even though you now have new tools, a wheel, and new clothes, you decide it's time to continue moving. Because although the Bronze Age and the Stone Age feel like night and day in human history, you know that there's a lot more to come and you want to experience it. The Iron Age. The difference between Bronze Age and Iron Age is not nearly as shocking as the difference between Stone Age and Bronze Age. However, it doesn't mean that the advancements are any less important. During the Iron Age, we don't necessarily see an entirely new way of life, although we see an expansion upon the previously established way of life in the Bronze Age, with some improvements. Obviously, the most notable difference being the new metal at play. Iron changed the metal tool game like never before, and that's because it was readily available and extremely durable. And because of that, iron tools became economical, and what that means is not only was there some tools, there was a lot of tools. And with more tools being in the hands of more people, human development began to ramp up even quicker than before. And because of this, we start to see society truly hit scale. Farming, both agriculture and livestock, became more optimized. Iron mining became more optimized. Metal forging became more optimized, and there was more of it. And because of this, everything that the Bronze Age really established, the Iron Age was able to run with. And that's kind of a common theme in every time period so far. Every lesson, development, technique developed in the previous time period can be applied and expanded upon in the next one. And that's kind of life in general, if you think about it. Regardless, with yourself being dropped in the Iron Age, my advice to you on surviving wouldn't be much different from the Bronze Age. Make sure you are refining your social skills to have a good circle of people around you, and make sure that you are obeying the law. Make sure you're not getting yourself into any wars, and make sure that you're making yourself valuable without making yourself a target. Since you already have experience from farming in the Bronze Age, I would recommend farming once again in the Iron Age. You could make a living, afford shelter, afford food, be around water, and if everything took a nasty turn, you would at least have the skill set to provide for yourself if all else fails. And might I add, in this time period, to take up some sort of sword fighting hobby in the background. Not because you want to fight in a war, but because you want to be able to protect yourself in any situation. And like they say, it's better to be a warrior in a garden than a gardener in a war. The medieval era. One of the first things you notice after landing yourself specifically in medieval England is the difference in people. Their civilizations like you saw in the Iron Age, although this civilization is different. It's obviously more developed, but one of the biggest things you notice is the sheer amount of class separation. Most of the people you see roaming the streets don't look super different than they did in the Iron Age. Although you do see almost a new class of people. You see merchants with elaborate clothing. You see nobility with clean robes. And you even get a glimpse of the king going down the street. And it's with this initial impression that you realize that you're not in Kansas anymore. Besides the differences that you see, there's a big difference that you can smell. Because being smack dab in the middle of medieval England, you can smell everybody and everything. And that's because with how developed cities have become, people are being more and more crammed into smaller and smaller places. And for that reason, everybody is literally in everybody else's business. And if you thought working on a farm in the Iron Age smelled bad, well, just smell medieval England. And make sure you keep your mouth closed if you see anybody on the second floor dropping fudge popsicles out of a bucket from their window. After noticing this rather large wealth gap, you understand that if you want to survive, your best chance is by at least having a bit of money. Because the vast majority of poor serfs, unless they are skilled laborers that are able to stay in town, are typically sent to the countryside for agricultural jobs. And while that was something you have experience in, you don't want to slave your life away anymore. And the life of a serf in medieval times is typically not one that screams longevity. Long hours, poor food, poor healthcare, no education, unsafe work conditions. There's a lot that could go wrong. And for that reason, with your goal of surviving, you want to have at least a few shillings in your pocket. You end up cozying up to a local sword merchant. And while this is a suitable side gig and you're able to learn the business and grow within the company, you realize that this society is a lot more complex than previous times. Obviously, royalty is relatively new in your historical travels, but on top of this, religion is a massive staple, not only in day-to-day life, but also in your survival. In medieval England, the Roman Catholic Church ruled over everything. And for that reason, if you were not following the rules of the church, you could be fined. And if you publicly disobeyed or potentially disagreed with the church, you could be killed. Which is why you quickly begin to study the Bible and learn a few prayers in Latin. After getting your side gig and getting familiar with the local customs, you are now met once again with the harsh reality of sickness. While human development has brought us new major cities, we are now experiencing the downfall of some of these overcramped and unsanitary cities, specifically plagues. And if you just happen to be living through 1348, your best chance of survival would be leaving the city immediately and taking the skills you learned in the Stone and Bronze and Iron Age to live off the land yourself. Because during the plague, even buying bread from somebody could be a death sentence. But outside of these relatively niche plague times, there is still the overarching lack of healthcare. Obviously, there was basically none in any of the previous time periods, but in the medieval era specifically, there was at least development with healthcare, but a lot of these treatments were actually more harm than good, meaning that if literally anything went wrong, whether it be a broken bone or a small cut, if you weren't in perfectly good shape and perfectly healthy, you were much closer to death than you would have ever been in the modern day. But even if you were lucky enough to be surviving in the medieval era during a time when there was no plague, you had a job that was making you not a poor serf, you still had to hope to God, literally, that there was not a war on the horizon. Because if you, as a young adult, were summoned to war, you essentially had no option. Either go to war or be killed for not going to war. And if you went to war and got injured, your chances of dying were high. And if you went to war and got injured and survived, once you came home, you would not be able to continue your work and you would essentially be poor on the street and likely die on that street. And with that hard lesson learned, you realize that if you want to survive in medieval times, you need to not only work a job, but be savvy enough to earn a higher than normal income. You have to religiously follow the church. You must never break a law. You must never upset a royal. You must never be in bad health or become injured. You must hope that a war never breaks out that requires your assistance. And spoiler alert, there was a lot of wars during the Middle Ages. And while you actually find the Middle Ages rather interesting, you know that this was not the place for you. And you decide to continue your journey. The early modern era. The early modern era is the shortest time period we're going to discuss on this list, besides the modern era, which is still ongoing. The early modern era was only 300 years long, spanning from 1500 to 1800 AD. But this time period was pivotal for human civilization. And while it consists of a lot of the things we've already discussed previously, the early modern era specifically is defined not by medals, but by intellectual pursuits, specifically in major developments in both world exploration and scientific pursuits. With the prosperity that Europe saw during the Middle Ages, they decided that their best next course of action during the early modern era was to begin expanding, which is why we saw a plethora of colonization during this time, because these European countries wanted more land, more wealth, more power. And because of this, the early part of the early modern era is rather tumultuous. There is a lot of religious instability, and also instability across the globe with this newfound colonization. And because literally so many revolutions took place during the early modern era, if you have to be a part of one of the revolutions, I would recommend being a part of the scientific revolution, specifically by trying to get your name in the same group as Copernicus, Galileo, or Newton. And while you might be thinking, I'm not nearly as smart as any of those guys, you don't need to be. Because if you're a modern person just being dropped in the early modern era, then you have a plethora of knowledge that you could use to change the world early and make yourself not only a remembered scientist, but also literally a god. But also keep in mind that revealing too much knowledge would actually not get you respected, it would get you killed, because you would just seem crazy. And if you challenge the status quo too much, well, that wouldn't be good for you. So with your goal of survival, you drop hints about knowing things and become a respected philosopher, making sure that you stay vague, but also inspirational. Near the end of the early modern era, you begin to see things that you recognize from the modern era. You see democracy, capitalism, banking, personal individuality, and this is all a part of the Enlightenment near the end of the early modern era. And it's with this realization that you remember that you're almost home. You've been going through almost all of human history, and now your final step is going back to the modern day. And while your time in every different time period has been brutal and tough, and you've missed even the most modern of luxuries like Uber Eats and a toilet, you've definitely grown to respect previous eras of history history, and you've had a major boost in respect for people who came before you, and essentially paved the way for you to live the comfortable life you live today. And with that, you realize that there's only one more place to go, and that's returning home, the modern era. Obviously, if you want to know how to live in the modern era, go look in the mirror or ask your grandpa. But I want to point out some interesting nuances that separated the early modern era from the modern era, because the modern era isn't just this week or this month. It dates back all the way to the early 1800s. And even though it was less than 200 years ago, the early 1800s is a much different time and lifestyle than the 2020s. One of the biggest technological advancements during the modern era is the Industrial Revolution, which swept through Europe, America, and eventually the world, and changed not only jobs and economies, but lives forever. But the Industrial Revolution wasn't just the building of factories and a boost in manufacturing jobs. It also meant further development in urban areas, specifically with developments in mining and transportation, with trains, buggies, and eventually cars becoming popular. And these tools, once again, changed the world and allowed further and further exponential development. And while this Industrial Revolution definitely improved the quality of life of some, there is undoubtedly still horrible labor conditions existing for those working in factories. And this includes women and children being paid next to nothing for backbreaking and then sometimes deadly jobs. But it's once again these hardships that people go through that brings us to the modern day, 2025. Now, this is not to say that the modern day is perfect, because it's not by any means. And this also isn't to say that every hardship in the past has been justified because it led us to today. Although, what I am trying to say is that the world we live in today is a work in progress and has been developed by hundreds of thousands of years of human development, driven by the urge to do better and never give up. Humans have always endured, persevered, and grew. And if you look at the timeline of humanity, that is a fact. So, although in the modern day we may have our own issues and be squishier than we used to be, we are still actively participating in this ongoing pursuit of human development, and humans, at the end of the day, are badasses. While there's definitely issues in the modern day, life has never been more comfortable and convenient, and easier to at least stay alive in. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, that is how humans survived in every time period. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this video, and if you did, check out the video on screen right now. It's actually a playlist of all of my in every time period videos. In that playlist, I have videos about what it was like to be rich in every time period, what it was like to be broke in every time period, and also how to get rich in every time period, and also how humans got high in every time period. There's a lot of great videos, and if you enjoyed this one, you're gonna love that playlist. Thank you guys so much for watching this video.